Well, there were multiple dynamics in play when during the time of Jesus, when he when he was preaching this sermon. And one of those dynamics was simply this, that people and relationships in that culture were disposable. Like we don't fully understand that because we have this Western mindset. But in that mindset, and actually that was true through most of ancient history, you only put into a relationship what you could get out of it. Powerful people did what they want without regard for the weak. And the weak, which was the vast majority of people, just tried to make do and not have someone in power get mad at them because you had no recourse to anything. A nation would conquer another nation, and then they would enslave that nation. Women, children, had almost no voice in culture at all. There were no public institutions to help other people. It was a culture where you, at all costs, won against another person. Winning was everything, whether it was in relationships or business or nations. Many of the moral things that we kind of like take for granted on how government and society should work did not exist. No one would even have conceived of them. It was completely foreign to people back then. And it was also true, not just in the world at large, but even in the Jewish community. And though they had this religious overlay from the Pharisees that they would teach, they still had a lot of the same cultural problems because the religious establishment made a priority of living according to laws. So they would tell you what the laws were, and you did the right things, and you expected others to do the right things back. There were rules on how much you could help other people, how many times you had to forgive them before you were off the hook, or when you could disassociate from certain people because they weren't the kind of people you wanted to be. And Jesus comes into all these relational ethics, and he stands it on its head. And so we're going to move now into a section where Jesus says something that he repeats 6 different times. It goes like this. He says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder. Anyone who murders will be subject to the judgment.' But I tell you," now, so there's this little thing going on here where he starts this section and he says, "You've heard something, but I'm going to tell you something." Right? So whenever he says, "But you've heard it," he's essentially saying this. He's saying, you've heard that it was said, this is something that you've been told over and over and over, but I'm going to tell you something new. This is how you were taught, but I'm going to tell you what it really means. And in doing this, he's making this real deliberate contrast between this legalistic, law-following way that the Pharisees looked at the world and how God intended it all to work. He's making this contrast between the two. He does this for 6 straight statements. That's what we're going to be studying the next 6 weeks. And what he does is he moves beyond the rules to the principles behind the rules. And so this morning we're going to look at the first one. But before we do, this is both freeing and troubling at the same time. Because here's what's really freeing about this. Jesus is freeing us from this rules-based way of living with all the guilt and the shame or the pride that comes from following the rules. So now, let me give you an example. See if you can figure this out. Let's say that for whatever reason, because of something you did in your car, you get called in front of the judge. Okay? So now you're in front of the judge for your infraction. And he says to you, he says, well, all those traffic rules you've been following, you know, all the lights, the stop signs, the speed limits, you know, the school zones, the don't go around a bus when the lights are flashing, all those rules, you know, when you're all those rules, don't worry about them. You don't have to follow them anymore. And you're like, this is amazing. I can do whatever I want. But the judge then looks at you and says, however, I only have one requirement of you. I want you to be a completely considerate driver, always courteously putting pedestrians, drivers, bicyclists, construction workers, law enforcement, and anyone else before yourself. Be concerned with their safety and their convenience. Now tell me, would you rather go back to following the rules? Which is harder? And this is essentially what's going on here. This was so important about what Jesus is teaching. He's saying the heart standard is the measurement of God's kingdom. And a right heart is always a higher standard of living than following the rules. Always. Every single time. And you know why that is? It's because we can modify our behavior without changing what's inside. You know this, because you can give without being a generous person. You can drive the speed limit and still be impatient. You can not cheat on your partner and still have divided affections. You could work 9 to 5 and still not be a worker of integrity. You can sing worship songs on Sunday and still worry all the time. You can be a politician who doesn't technically break any rules and still not be trustworthy. Why? You know why this is? It's because rules and laws provide a minimum standard below which you get punished. That's all a rule is. That's all the laws are. The laws of our land and of our system is simply the minimum required behavior past which we get punished. So if you don't want to get punished, here's the minimum standard. Stay there. You're good. Growing up, I did this in the church, right? The debate in the church was, how far can I go before I sin? Right? Anybody ever had that statement? Right? How far? No one's going to put their hand up. Okay. Right? That's what you did. You were a teenager or you were a young adult, and you're like, okay, what can I get away with? Okay, I can go dancing as long as it's not this kind of dancing because then it crosses the line, or I can have this many drinks because then this crosses the line. And it's this whole idea of what can I get away with before it's wrong? No one was ever inspired to greater and higher living through rules. So here's the problem. Jesus is moving us in this entire section from following the rules, which, while difficult, is under our control, right, because what I can achieve, to an open-ended idea of perfection that I can never achieve. So think about this. Jesus is calling us into something that we are guaranteed to fall short of. Why? Because when he calls us to that standard, the heart standard, we realize, I can't do this. I can't do this all the time. And Jesus says, that's right. And so you need my grace. And then we begin to lean into his grace. And the more we lean into his grace, the more we're inspired to holy living, because we're like, wow, he still loves me despite all of that. I want to live for him. So we're inspired to holy living, but the more we try and live a holy living, the more we realize that we're falling short of the standard. And the more we fall short of the standard, the more we rely on his grace. And the more we lean into his grace. And do you see how this works? And Jesus is saying, that's life in the kingdom, not rule following. And so that's the theme we're going to go with in the next few weeks, because that's what Jesus is doing. He does this over and over and over. And we're going to start with the first one right now. Here's what he says. You've heard that it was said to people long ago, and he's talking, long time ago, like the 10 Commandment kind of things, that you should not murder. Anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I'm telling you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, raka, we'll talk about that in a second, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Now, there's a lot there. But what he is saying here was utterly revolutionary in the world at the time. I think it's still revolutionary today. Because here's what he's telling them. I want you to value relationship over rightness. This is your job. You want to live life in the kingdom? Then you need to value relationship over rightness. People are more important than getting your way or being right. And he uses the 6th of the 10 Commandments to illustrate this. You've heard it was said, you shall not murder. That was the sixth commandment. Thou shalt not murder. And he's saying this, to be righteous then, in the eyes of the law, was to not murder. By the way, it was a lot more common then than it is today, right? Life was very disposable then. We have a little bit of a higher level in our culture on this. But if you did kill someone, then you had to go through all the normal penalties of the law and the court system and all that stuff. Now, does it seem foolish to you that that's the standard? Right? Don't kill anybody. You're good. And you're thinking, yeah, that's kind of stupid. Except we do this all the time. Are you a good person? Yeah, I think so. I haven't killed anybody. Right? How many people have you heard that before? Oh, they're a nice guy. At least they didn't kill anybody. Right? I mean, we do this all the time. This is our standard. And this is no different back then. It's almost a joke at times. But Jesus' point is this. You can convince yourself that you're good because you're not doing violence to another person, and you've completely missed the point. And he goes deeper, and he goes to the symptom which is underneath, and the real problem. Because murder is just the symptom. The real problem is anger. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Relational anger is a huge problem. And by the way, one of Jesus' disciples, John, right, one of his closest, if not the closest, he later stated it this way: anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. Wow. You know, Clarence Darrow, he was probably the most famous criminal lawyer of his generation. You feel like he must have read the words of Jesus because he said this once. He said, everyone is a potential murderer. I have not killed anyone, but I frequently get satisfaction out of obituary notices. And you all know exactly what that means, because there are times where you get on Facebook and you see someone make a comment about miserable their life is, and you go, yeah. And then you cover it up by writing a nice note saying, I'm praying for you, but inside you're still saying, yeah, okay. Do you know that murder in the heart is the basis for real murder? There's 25,000 plus murders a year in the U.S. And the vast, vast, vast majority are from people you know. I was at a wedding, and it was a second wedding for these parties, and so the maid of honor was this lady's daughter, and she did the toast. So she did this beautiful toast, and at the end she instructed them to gaze at each other's eyes, and they did, and she says, I want you to remember, you are now looking at the eyes of the person statistically most likely to kill you. Which, by the way, is true. Maybe not the best toast, but I thought that was pretty cute. But Jesus is saying, look, you guys, this righteous rule-following stuff, you're missing the point, because anger is the issue. You need to value relationship over rightness. Because the real problem is not the violence, the physical or emotional violence against another person, it's anger. Well, why is that? And Jesus unpacks this. He says, first of all, it's because anger leads to feelings of contempt. And he has this little thing here. He says, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. They're two different words. We obviously lose it because the translation, because they're Greek words. But they're both words. They're very similar in their meaning. They both are words of contempt, of, you idiot. What is wrong with you? You're so stupid. Why would you do something like that? One is contempt for the way someone thinks, and the other is contempt for their heart or their character, right? They're kind of the two sides of this thing. And you all know this, because when we get angry, it almost always leads to contempt of some type, because we begin to judge them. We begin to look down on them. We look at how they're living. I can't believe you would do that. Why would you treat me that way? Why would you say that to me? Why would you do that to them? I mean, and there's this self-righteousness that kind of bubbles up and go, yeah, at least I'm not. Right? At least I didn't do that. At least I didn't say those things. This is where we begin to, when we see these things, this is where we rehearse conversations. No one's ever done this, right? You know, where you think of the conversation in your head and you kind of play it out. Do you know in those conversations, you are the wisest person who's ever walked the face of the earth? Because you know in that conversation that in the end, you say this, you drop the mic, and you walk away, and they are stricken to their knees in repentance because of your brilliance, and it has never yet played out like that in real life for me. Right? But this is the problem. He's like, because when we get into this place where our anger, we start to feel contemptuous, which means we begin to look down on them, and they're the problem, and what they believe is the problem, and how they live is the problem. And all this is coming from frustrated desires, because there's things we want to see happen that aren't happening. James talks about this, brother of Jesus. We have these expectations or desires, and because it's not happening and other people are the problem, we begin to see them as roadblocks or problems instead of people and opportunities. And so we have this need to defend ourselves of saying, no, you can't say that to me. I'm right, you're wrong. And we look at how we can undermine them. So who are those people for you? Who do you struggle with? And it could be an entire people group. That's how racism goes. It could be a person. Could be a small subset of people. You know that person where you think, you know what, they just don't have a clue what they're doing. You know what, I don't have any time for them. I'm not giving them the time of day. You know what, they're just wrong. They're just weird. The way they do things is just off. Who is that person or people? Jesus is saying, look, your angry attitudes and your words lead to judgment just as much as violence. And this is the ultimate irony of all of this. The Pharisees, who were so concerned with following the letter of the law, which to them was, don't commit murder, that all they did was commission somebody else to kill Jesus on their behalf so that their hands were clean. And when we look back, we think, no, they're not. Their hearts were filled with anger and contempt towards Jesus. You know, have you ever noticed that when people are angry, things get broken? I will not ask for a show of hands on who has thrown something or broken something when they're angry. But it could be all kinds of stuff, right? It's broken things, whether it's a tennis racket or a golf club or a phone or a door or, who knows, a plate, right? Things get broken, but it's more than that. Because anger is when relationships get broken. It's when hearts get broken. It's when we say things that we can't erase. And it happens at work. It happens in marriage. It happens with our children. And all I have to do is ask you of those times in your life where your parents said things in anger that left a scar for a long time. This is what Jesus is getting at. He says, look, guys, you don't understand. The issue here is anger. And anger leads to these feelings of contempt and judgment on other people. And unresolved conflict, then, you have this conflict with people. When you do that, it destroys community. And Jesus illustrates it by showing what happens when there's this broken community being, relationship between people. Because he says, look, you got to settle matters quickly with your adversary, or he's taking you to court. Like, do you see the logical progression? Because they're thinking, well, if you murder someone, yeah, you're going to have to go to court. Okay? He's saying, no. If you're angry, it's going to cause relational issues, and it's going to cause friction, and there's going to be problems, and they're going to take you to court. He says, you better deal with this, because it's going to cause all kinds of strife in your relationship. And for us, we may not be taken to the judge because of our relational conflict. That may not be what happens, but it damages the relation nonetheless. And here's the thing, okay? It doesn't matter if your anger is righteous or not, it still destroys community. You can be completely righteous in your anger. It's not going to help the other person. But people say all the time, well, Jesus got angry. Look, he overturned the tables in the temple. He got angry at people. So I'm going to make you a deal, because I don't think you're righteously angry that much. So here's the deal. Jesus lived a life of ministry about 3.5 years. We saw him get righteously angry about 4 or 5 times. So that's twice a year. That means twice a year you can be righteously angry. All the rest are not. And I say that because some of you think you're righteously angry all the time, and you're not. And that's Jesus' point. He says anger is the issue. This isn't even about righteous anger versus not righteous anger. Anger breaks community. It breaks things down. And this, up until this point in his message, people are probably like, okay, this is new. We kind of were focused on the behavior, but you're saying anger is the issue because anger wrecks community. Okay, Jesus, I can kind of get on board with this. And then Jesus lays down the hammer, which is simply this. If you're offering your gift at the altar, and you remember that someone has something against you, leave your gift and go be reconciled. Since anger is so destructive to relationships, I want you to deal with it. We defeat anger by moving intentionally towards the other person. Now, some of you have heard this, but some of you may not. Jesus is making a statement here that to us, we don't really understand. He says, look, here's what's going to happen, guys. Because of all this, if you get to bring your offering to the altar. Now, when they say that, this is the sacrifice in Jerusalem at the altar. Now, remember, he's preaching to Galileans. Galilee was 80 miles from Jerusalem. So in those days, that's a week, right? Maybe 5 days if you're moving quick. And it didn't happen very often. You couldn't just leave home and go. So what happened is people made these pilgrimages to the temple to offer their sacrifice. It was their religious duty. It's what the law required of them. It's what God invited them to do. And so they would plan for this for months. And then they would take the family, or they would go and they would make sure that everything was taken care of. And they would travel all the way to Jerusalem. And they would usually do this at festival days. So now you've invested in a week of travel time. You get there, you've invested money because you had to stay in inns and hotels, or you had to buy all the provisions. Then you get there, you have to make sure you have a sacrifice. And so you got to go find it. If you didn't bring it, you got to buy it. Then you got to stand in line. And since there's a few 100,000 people doing this, it's like being at Disneyland, except at the end of it, you get to kill something, right? It's not the same kind of line. But this is really, really important. This is like the pinnacle of their worship for the year. And so you have spent all that time, and now you stood in line for 10 hours. It's your turn. It's the one time all year you get to do the thing that God is requiring for you to do. And Jesus says, you're next in line, and you remember that you got a problem with them. Stop what you're doing and go get it right. Now, put your gift down, get out of line, and travel 80 miles home and go fix it before you do anything with God. Now, maybe he's doing the exaggeration on purpose, but what he's trying to illustrate here is how incredibly important this is. Dealing with conflict is a big deal to God. Our relationship with God, our worship, is negatively affected by anger and unresolved conflict. That's why it's so destructive, and why we say we have to value relationship over rightness. Because what Jesus is saying, it is more important to God that you go make that right than you follow the rules of the law. That's a little troubling. Did you ever stop to think that the conflict you're not dealing with is what keeps you from having proper worship or a proper relationship with God? We like to separate them. Jesus is saying you can't do that. Have you ever thought or wondered that the connectiveness, the effectiveness of the church as a whole is compromised by unresolved conflict and unforgiveness? Dealing with conflict is a big deal to God. And guess what? The responsibility to deal with it is on the one who notices. Not the offender, the one who notices. Look what it says. He says, you're in line. He says, and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. It doesn't say whether they did anything wrong. It doesn't say whether you did anything wrong. It doesn't even say if they're correct or not. There might be anger that you had nothing to do with. You're like, look, I didn't do anything wrong. Jesus is saying that none of that matters. You noticed, go make it right. You cannot put it on them. You cannot say, well, when they make the first move, I'll make the next one. You don't get any wiggle room. Remember, heart standard is the highest standard. He says, you guys are the ones that have to go. And in fact, the imperative, the word in this entire section, the one that is the command that Jesus gives, it's the word go. You move towards them. You seek reconciliation. The initiative is on the one who notices the problem. Which leads to the third implication, which is that we're supposed to do it promptly. Not only is it important to deal with conflict, and it's our responsibility if we notice it, but it's important to do with it promptly. That's why he says, look, leave your gift. Go make it right. Because what he could have said is, well, you're already there. Finish the worship service. Sing the songs. Do the sacrifice. Hang out with your relatives for a little bit. I mean, when you get home, they'll still be there. You can fix it then. You realize he's not saying this. No. This is urgent. This matters. And anybody in this room who's had an unresolved conflict that has lagged for years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because it's never far from your mind. And it kind of weighs on you. And you try and ignore it, and you try and push it in the back of your mind, but it always comes back. In fact, his whole next section talks about the same thing, right? Settle matters with your adversary quickly. In other words, don't wait. He says, look, if you don't do this, if you don't try and get things right, it's going to be too late for you. And again, we might not end up at court, but it may cause relationships to be damaged beyond repair. Don't wait till it gets that far. Waiting will negatively impact you and them. And by the way, when he says to make peace, it means to be well disposed with another person. It's saying, look, I'm going to make every effort to reconcile. And you all know this because we've talked about this when we talk about forgiveness and all that other stuff. You can't force someone to be reconciled to you. We all know that. And you might really desire it, and they might not. You can't control that. But what you can control is making every effort to do this and having the heart that puts relationship first. Because remember, the standard is your heart. It's not how many times you've tried. It's not whether you've set boundaries. He's concerned with the state of our hearts. And to make it even worse, I tell you, Jesus raised the standard here. Conflict resolution is necessary with everyone because have you noticed in this? He talks to two different groups of people. He says a brother or sister, someone of faith, someone in the family, or your adversary, someone who's not a Jesus follower. He says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're a Christian or not. It doesn't matter if they're a person of faith or not. It doesn't matter if they're nice or not. It doesn't matter if they like you or not. It doesn't matter. You go. Be reconciled. Make every effort to do this. Your heart towards that ungodly jerk at work is to be the same as towards someone within the church family. My friends, we are to value relationship over rightness. In a world where we're judged by what we do, I wonder what would happen if our words and our attitudes were judged exactly the same way. Where would you land? It strikes me that this is as good a week as any to celebrate communion, because communion is all about peace, and Jesus bringing peace. So I'm going to ask the elders to come up. And before we close the service out, I have a concluding thought. But before we do that, I want us to come on up and to take the communion. Take it back to your seat. The guys will just be standing across the front. So just come on up and take it and go back to your seat. We're all going to partake of it together at the end. But as you do that, I want you to think who, or maybe plural, whom, is God pointing the finger at for you today in terms of reconciling conflict and anger?